I'm just going to talk about basically my personal experience and stuff. Okay. So, it's kind of things I've been talking about. Hi, hello. How are you? Good. Good. HYDS?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Did Abby make you come?
She didn't make us come.
She suggested we come.
Why did she suggest? Oh, okay. Bad. Whatever. Anyway, so these are the things I'm going to be talking about, and yeah. So I'm going to talk about experience of different circuits. I'm going to talk about takeaways. I'm going to talk about perspective on KIDA, and what I think can happen to change. I don't know. Okay. So firstly, this is a very subjective and personal and subjective take on KIDA. So it's obviously not going to be representative. I'm obviously going to be wrong, so I'm not going to say anything offensive, honestly, so it's just being targeted. Yeah. And I don't, like, I thought, or my understanding was the point of this isn't really, like a matter session necessarily, so I'm just going to talk about like how to get better in debate or anything because of that. I don't know very well, but yeah. So those are the things I'm going to talk about. Yeah. So first I started off, wow. So I prepared pictures. So first I started off debating in Korean high school, in a Korean high school called Daewon Foreign Language High School. And that's when I first started off debating. And I think it was very similar, and the reason why I wanted to start by talking about Korean high school debate circuit is I think it's a very good reference point when judging KIDA or when judging the Korean debate circuit, because there's a similar talent pool. Like obviously some people like me, for example, go abroad, but I think generally the people who are active in Korean high school debate circuit has a propensity to be active in the Korean university circuit. But also secondly that they sometimes face similar problems in the sense that they have a lot of other things that they do. They live in the same society that values similar stuff. And that's why I wanted to start here. I think one of the, what I'm going to try to contend here is that, I have stuff written down here, that one of the biggest problems and one of the things that I think the Korean debate circuit could focus a lot on is to try to maintain or try to retain debaters that have been active in the Korean high school circuit. Because something about being a successful debate circuit has to do a lot about how long the members have been debating and how active the members are debating. And it's one of those, I didn't hear this personally, but it's one of those famous quotes about how, a guy named Victor Finkel, who won Worlds in 2011, is this very famous Monash debater. And then he did an interview in one of those Australian, I don't know if it was the debating review at Monash or some other kind of newspaper. So what's your success to competitive debating? And I think he famously said, it's I've been debating for 11 years, and of course I have to be good at this by this time. So one thing is that you always are going to be better just by continuously debating, even if you don't do any kind of matter session, or if you don't just go to international tournaments. So the point is that a lot of people start debating at a very young age nowadays in Korea. But they seem to be, the interest in debate seem to be dwindling and not necessarily extends to the university debate circuit. So that's something I think should be a priority, or at least something to have in mind when thinking about KIDA, or when thinking about generally how to understand KIDA and stuff. But I think this is changing, primarily maybe due to Hagwons, because there is a relationship between very young debaters and successful university debaters being maintained. They might be continuously debating. Point is here that I think experience is an important part of success, and that trying to tap into the Korean high school debate pool is important. But also another thing that I want to talk about here is that a lot of Korean high school debaters enjoy success overseas, and I think that's the kind of success that a lot of Korean university debaters want to achieve later on in their career. The reason why I think the reason why Korean high school debaters succeed overseas in other international tournaments is primarily due to something that all of us have, which is generally we have a high level of English proficiency. We are generally sound more fluent, which really helps when it comes to debating at for example at Worlds, because there is racism to some extent existing in all these kind of international tournaments in which there's basically white people judging and stuff like that. So those things, basically we have good style. We also have generally very good coaching because we have people like Andy, we have people like Logan, we have people who like are very, not very old, but other very experienced, seasoned debaters who are willing to help out societies like KU or like Edis, and those are resources that we can really tap into and like try to succeed. I'm going to talk about this later on, but that's what my take of Korean high school debate. I was going to talk more, but then we can talk later about my personal stuff. So, what else is there? Yeah, so APTA, that was me. So another circuit that I was a part of was the American Parliamentary Debate Circuit, which is slightly different from BP and slightly different from AP. And I think I have a link here, maybe. So, no, I don't. Wait a minute. So, one thing I wanted to talk about is, or suggest, is that there are some takeaways, and I think the best thing to demonstrate what APTA is like is this video. So, this is just a round. I'm not going to show the entire round. That'd be a great way to spend time. But this is a finals round at one of the big tournaments in APTA. And to explain briefly about how APTA works is there is no motion set. So there are two teams. You're only determined by sides. So you're on the government or you're in the opposition. And the topic that they debate upon is determined by the government team. So the government team can prepare a case, and that is going to be the topic of the debate. And then obviously there's going to be a balance between how many times you gov, how many times you off, and yeah. And what that leads to is a great diversity of topics being debated. And this is one of like the extreme examples, but still I thought it was like interesting. So that's her name is Jean. She's a senior at Brown. Not now, but.
Thank you so much for being here. I am truly honored to be in this final round.
Can you hear this?
A wonderful partner. Saya, true friends. And so I got my team here. And Yale also, exactly. Alright, so we're going to run a case. They asked us to run something funny, and if you guys aren't laughing, it's going to be a really sad round. But this should be really funny. This is also a case that they know about, and it's not top choice, sorry. So here's case statement. You're the mother of a 16-year-old daughter who's pretty average in her dating experience. Not probably already licensed. Although she's single now, she's had a couple boyfriends, one of whom she dated for a couple of months. She knows about sex, but you think she's still a virgin. We say, give the girl a Bible.
That's the topic. And they continuously debate upon that, but it's like one of those really provocative things and one of those things that aren't often debated. Did you hear the topic? Yeah? It's one of those, and it's like, if you want to see the round, I can show it to you. It's very interesting and very good round, I think, about how, like, a topic that is oftentimes not debated in a majority of circuits. We can, like, see this. I was planning to watch a bit more of it, but, yeah, anyway. That's one thing that I think demonstrates how APTA can be very creative and how it has, like, generally is open to a lot of forms of, kill me, because I'm really bad at this. Yeah. And that's us. North American BP circuit. So, one thing about the North American BP circuit is that it's extremely competitive and it's extremely well funded. One thing that's really great about debating in America is that your school generally pays for almost everything. So if you want to go to a tournament, for example, I went to Worlds this year in Malaysia. School paid for obviously my registration fee, but also like all of my flights and all other expenses that I might have to pay. For example, my cab from the airport to the hotel, or sometimes when the organization committee is not providing food. For example, that one day between like end of prelim and break rounds, then you also pay for your food. If you submit a receipt, they will pay for it. So they're extremely well funded, and therefore extremely successful. Last time, I think the top 4 teams at Worlds, out of the top 4 was 2, I think, were North American teams, and they generally are very good. Like top 4 out of the top 10 speakers, I think, and they won Worlds last time, so they're generally good. So they also can like fly teams to all these kind of different tournaments and are very resourceful. and there's incredibly intelligent speakers who are very well read, which is going to be a point I talk about later on. But generally, yeah. I'm not doing a very good job of doing description because I'm kind of flustered. But are there any questions about any curious anything that you're?
Is there a disparity between the universities? Like, if you said you had the capability to fly all the way over to Worlds, they're very well read, is that because you come from a well-established university, or is that throughout the American circuit?
So I think generally it's not necessarily about prestige in college, but more about how well established your program is. For example, the same question, I asked the same question to actually Brett, and one thing is he comes from University of Alaska. And University of Alaska isn't the most prestigious school in the United States of America. It is like not a bad school, but it is not the most prestigious school. But they have a professor that is basically Joshua Parkins Ulrich, who only takes care of the debate program and has necessary resources. Also, like even the worst case scenario is if you're in an American college and you're debating in an American college, they at least give you some kind of grant as basically as a money. So if you're doing something, they give you money for do that. So you will have money to travel. Sometimes you'll have to pay for tournament registration. But another thing that's really good about these circuits is that they are susceptible. They are willing to, for example, not get money from new societies. They're waive their registration fee from new circuits and try to fund more judges or more debaters to come to their tournament. Yeah. Also, yeah.
How do people generally perceive like societies within universities?
Oh, so one thing is so for example, in my school, that a lot of people have debate background. Like they're some of them are state champions. They're not in Harvard. I heard that in Harvard they have 200 debate champions in their entire freshman class. But it's not like that. But it's obviously the worst school. But there are a lot of people who have debate experience, and people are really I don't know, really. So it's kind of obviously it's kind of like a nerdy thing to do. It's kind of a nerdy thing to do. I think it's it's a nerdy thing to do in a good way, right? Yeah. So people are generally curious. They know a lot, so they know the basics because they had friends in high school who did debate, or they know someone who did debate. They are for example, my roommate will always ask me so what's your debate topic today? It's there were 5 debate topics, but still, and he would be curious. Yeah, so generally supported, I think. But there are some people like those bro athletes. In America, the king of athletes is, in college at least, it's football, and then it's lacrosse. And all of them are there's this fashion called whatever I do, my dad, if you do something to me, my dad will sue you fashion, which is basically salmon shorts, pastel colored shorts, and long Polo Ralph Lauren shirts, backwards hats, and blonde and hair all over the place. Yeah, so those obviously those people will, I guess, look down on people, but it's something that professors are supportive of because it's academic. It's generally smart people like it because in classrooms you have debate as well. Anything else that you're curious of? No? Moving on. Also, it's safe. Also, very, very well done. It's an important component, I think. So that's one thing I wanted to spend some time on. Is one thing about KIDA, I think, is that where the Korean debate circuit is, there's a kind of 2 distinct models inside it. I think one idea of how a debate, 2 different models of a debate circuit to prosper. One is the idea of having a very strong domestic base. It doesn't have to go to international tournaments, doesn't have to go to other, break at UADC or break at AVP, and just basically have a vibrant debating society. And I think another aspect of it is we should basically be more successful outside of Korea. We should get better, we should go to more international tournaments, we should break more, and we should have a stronger presence at Worlds and all these kind of stuff. I don't think one is better than the other. But I think what's important is, if one thing is a goal, then you should, Korean debate circuit should, to some extent, pursue that goal with some kind of vigor. So for example, if the goal is to just have a vibrant domestic debate community, I think at least at the leadership of KIDA, that needs to be some kind of strategic direction that they try to pursue and try to have more domestic tournaments at the expense of, for example, going to international tournaments. Or if it's the other way around, you should try to encourage your freshmen to go to all these international tournaments, especially if there's like Solbridge Australs. One thing is maybe you want to, like, I guess, have a session there, or say you have to see the outrounds at Solbridge Australs, because it's a genuinely good opportunity. But the point is, there are different kinds of way for a circuit to prosper, and it doesn't always have to be like one way of going to a lot of international tournaments. I think APTA is a very good, is an illustrative example of it, because you can like in APTA, like no one cares if you broke at World, and not no one, but like many people like don't care if you broke at Worlds or if you like did very well at this other Oxford IB or Cambridge IB. It's just really about their debate circuit because it has a special format. It's about what kind of interesting cases you have. There are a lot of like interesting cases or interesting debate topics. My very first APTA debate was it was round 1. We went against a school called Providence College, and the tournament was Harry Potter themed. So everybody was like, also it was like kind of near Halloween, so everybody kind of dressed up as something related to Harry Potter. So it would like the most, some people, the shyest people would just like wear some like round glasses. I actually went on like full wizard look. Or some people just carry a wand or whatever. But anyway, round 1 was like basically this guy has a full Harry Potter Gryffindor necktie, robe, wand, hat, everything. Like walks up to the podium and is like, Prime Minister, so thank you very much for calling me up here, Mr. Speaker. The case we have today is you are the Ministry of Magic. So that you place your actor as the Ministry of Magic, and basically, would you reveal your existence to the Muggle world? And we had a very interesting debate over that, but it was like very nerdy and very Harry Potter heavy. I never read Harry Potter like extensively.
Shame.
Harry Potter is a piece of shit.
Shame!
It's not literature, but I know better things to do there. It's like I'm more of a Lord of the Rings guy, so no one.
Pretentious.
What's the difference? One has extensive background in mythology. The other is just out of the mind of a Scottish writer. So. Imagination. Shame on you. But the second round was this like another, and that was interesting. I thought that was like something that you can talk about. The second round was something like really stupid, and basically it was like so it was another government team, and this time they were from American University, and then they were talking about how if you find if you're walking in the woods and you find someone who looks exactly like you, should you kill them? Is the topic. I thought it was stupid. Abby thinks it's very philosophical and interesting. But like those topics, sometimes you don't know what to do. But the point of all these stories, is to say that it's okay to be different. It's okay to have one's own style. KIDA doesn't necessarily have to be a powerhouse in Asian debating, but just having a vibrant debate circuit and also having interesting debate topics. Because another point that I want to make is at least one of the observations and one of the things that I think of is a lot of debates in Korea, especially the rounds in KNC, were very, very similar. They revolve around very, very similar clashes. And if you're like really master making some arguments, for example, like responsibility of government, or for example, like this is something that's necessary, then it seems like you can win a lot of rounds. But the problem, or like the slight deficit of that is, then it's not really interesting to debate because the topics that you talk about are always limited. And because a lot of members in KIDA, I don't think are too invested in reading too much about the world. So therefore, the topics aren't going to branch out to interesting, for example, IR things or interesting things that are happening all around the world that might be very beneficial, that might be really helpful, but that doesn't necessarily happen. So therefore, debating isn't as interesting. Therefore, people don't really see the merit of coming to debate tournaments other than to, break, or other than to basically win a tournament to get a speaker award. So I think that's something that is important to consider. And another thing to take away from this is debate topics doesn't necessarily have to be about right now. It can be about fictional worlds, like Harry Potter things. You can always have tiny tournaments, Harry Potter IB or the television IB, I don't know, what's a famous like 해장금하기 or whatever. Like, those things are possible, and you can always go back into history to find other interesting topics. I think one of the finals round at I think APTA Nats a couple of years ago was, you are the United States before independence. Should you actually join the movement for independence? Which is a historical debate that can happen because all of us are educated in Korean high school, or like most of us have background of Korean history, and that might be an interesting debate topic. But those things don't happen. I don't know for some reason, but because debate seems to be this formulaic concept that a lot of people don't try to branch out and have creativity. Yeah. So this is what I probably have been spending a lot of time thinking on. Obviously, again, this is like some of this is very obvious because I didn't spend much time on KIDA. I didn't go to a lot of sessions. I did go to some sessions, but I only went to one KIDA. Most of you have more experience than me. But I think there are some things to consider. I wanted to just, say out loud. So, first, a generally nice point, I think, is that probably KIDA has one of the best preconditions for a debate circuit to prosper. They're very motivated people who would, once it actually, so to some extent there's a general interest, and a lot of people are willing to debate, or at least try it out for once. People are generally good at English, at least those who want to participate in debate tournaments. There are good institutions. All the schools that you go to are better, ranked higher probably than other very successful Asian debating universities. And there's a well-established organization called KIDA. There are other well-established organizations that, if you are willing to do something, there's a constitution that Abby, knows the back and forth of it. And those things are good. Some things that I think aren't as excellent and don't really maximize the potential of KIDA. So one thing is that I think, honestly, the majority of debaters are not as committed compared to debaters at other circuits. Generally, there is, I think, in order for you to debate, there is a minimum level of knowledge that you need to acquire in order to access the debate topic. Sometimes that means at least reading the first page of the New York Times, or at least knowing generally what's going on in the world, or at least having thought of some kind of philosophy. So whether you at least read the first chapter of utilitarianism or Kantian, categorical comparatives, I think those things are a bare minimum of knowledge. And debating sometimes it is a sport. It is a sport in the sense that you are trying to compete and trying to make better arguments. But to another extent, in order to be very good at that sport, there are some basic things that you have to do. And I think a lot of people fall short on that under that standard. And the deficit of that is many times, that's why a lot of times debating isn't as interesting. There's not very much going on. It's just the same old abstract arguments happening all the time. And those things clearly can be solved, and it should be solved, I think. I think that people should start to think of debating in a slightly different way. It's not just about you speaking in English, but it's more about trying to portray your intelligence, or trying to portray thoughts that you have been carefully thinking of, or been reading a lot on, or trying to express your interest. And those things, that's when I think debate really becomes interesting. So, linked to this, I think, is a problem of we lack kind of experts. I think one thing about this is a lot of you major in international relations or business. There are a lot of debate topics about international relations and business, yet at the same time, for example, I don't major in business, but it's not very mind-blowing to me that when a business major talks about, for example, a business topic at the KIDA, the only time that I was impressed by someone with having a very good understanding of some kind of business is the round about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and it was a KIDA team who really had very in-depth analysis, a very good understanding of the system of CSR and how it helps and how corporates adapt to CSR. But those things are very rarely happen. So I think it should happen more often than that. I think if you are a major in philosophy, when you're debating, you should try to bring in more of a philosophical aspect to the debate. If you are an international relations major, you should try to use your understanding in debate, or your understanding in economics, probably, I think you always all learn that, into debate. And if that doesn't happen, then there's really no point of having a debating community of diverse people, because it's just people saying the same arguments that you thought of, we can all think of without reading a book about something. And contributions, and you are all members of KIDA, and your contribution to KIDA is probably be adding some new aspect or some new perspective about issues that are being debated. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this mind-blowing approach to philosophy. It just, because there is no such thing as like the same idea or a same perspective. Everything is slightly different because it's based on your personal experience or your whatever books you read. So I think one thing that should happen in KIDA more is that you should try to incorporate your expertise, because we are all majors, like we are all to some extent are going to be an expert in something. Those things have to be incorporated a bit more. And two more things I think I'm going to talk about is I think there's a cult of personality in KIDA. That is to say that some individuals have a larger sway in how debate is viewed and how we should debate. And I'm not going to call names, and I don't think it's a bad thing, because it's obviously there are always heroes in any kind of debate circuit, right? Singapore, for example, worships Ashish, worships Shengwu, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think when it becomes slightly negative is when their influence actually deters younger members from being very, very good. Because the problem of that is if you have like a role model, that's going to be good. But when it kind of crosses the line is when you measure your debating ability and your performance compared to not just this standard that you have, but to someone else's standard. So if you go to the reason why I'm gonna, so one example I have was I went to a KU session, and there was this very, very respected, very seasoned debater, KU debater, who was judging there. And the debate wasn't very good. And the reason why it wasn't very good was every time they were making arguments, they were looking at that specific person and trying to seek their approval. That the very idea that you're conscious of that automatically hampers your ability to be a good debater, because you don't know what you're doing well. You only know whether you're doing well or not at the moment that the person that you respect nods at your argument. And that's not a very good standard to have. And that's not just, I think, just restricted to Korean University or just restricted to other well-respected institutions that have very good judges. I think it's generally, I think it's a general kind of consensus that exists on KIDA about how if you're going against this debater, then automatically, of course it's going to be amazing. Or when there's this judge, you have this idea of like what kind of debating they respect, and that might be the right debating. Whatever. I think the point is to try to shed away that. Just try to develop your own sense of, so that older people don't have a larger sway in how debating should be viewed and how debating is practiced in the younger generation. One thing that I thought was why Harvard is going to probably do very well, and what was a very successful transition in this year's team was, so 2014 Worlds, there was this Harvard team that won. And they were really amazing, they were really smart, and yeah, they were very well respected within Harvard. But as soon as they graduated, there was this younger generation, current year, the team that currently are grand finalists at Worlds 2015, there was just basically newbies. What I found really amazing was the older generation didn't apply their own standard. These guys are famous for doing there's a style of debating in which you says we have 8 points of analysis and basically trying to matter load, right? The newer generation wasn't very interested in it. They were more about being more rhetorically savvy. They were more about trying to get the big picture right. And what I would expect, or at least the way I practiced coaching in Korea to some extent, was to try to drill in the style that was successful for me. Even at the high school level, even at the university level. Before that, what I generally thought was, oh, you know what, that's all good, and I think that might be effective in some rounds, but here's a way that really worked for me, you should practice that too. But once that happens is, everybody's going to be a good debater in completely different ways. Sometimes, even if it's a point that initially doesn't make sense, if you're really good at it, if you really have a very good understanding of that topic, you will make a very good point out of it. But that path, then it's just going to be the same old debating arguments that will be happening all the time. I think that's a kind of big, problematic thing that exists in KIDA, because let's say one person I really respect is Seth. And that is not the KU person that I've talked about previously, but I really respect Seth. But the arguments that sets make will not be made better, but by a Iro Kyu debater. It's only going to work for Seth, and I think people should have more independence, and this kind of cult of personality should be kind of shed away. What else do I have? So, yeah, I think I talked about this. I think this. I asked before doing this presentation. I asked some foreigner friends about what do you think, what's their general impression of KIDA, and one thing that was one thing that a lot of people agreed to was that a lot of debates in Korea revolve around very similar arguments and clashes. The thing that we talked about, responsibility of government, like focusing on very practical arguments of why this will work or why this will not work, and the same old principles being applied. And that is good to some extent, because then you can practice that very well, but debates are going to be special in their own way, and not all feminism debates occur around the same kind of clashes. There will be slightly different nuances, and you lose out upon those when those things don't happen. Yeah. So there was one thing more I want to talk about, but anyway. So one thing is that there's some suggestions. This obviously, I just came up with this because I felt the need to do so, because I problematized something that, I just like to be responsible to some extent. But these aren't suggestions or solutions that are going to solve the problem of KIDA. There's nothing like that. Just want to talk about some interesting things that I thought was interesting to me. So, have more discussions on tagging is obviously spend more time thinking about meta debate and these things. So I'll go one by one. So tabbing. So do you know what tabbing is? Tabulation. So in a tournament, there's a tab director that determines the matchups and determines whose judge allocations and stuff like that. One aspect of tournaments, especially in Korea, that are incredibly under-discussed is the aspect of tabulation. Realistically, tabbing can determine the outcome of a tournament more so than the CAP, because that's the person who realistically changes the outcome. If you go against the easier opponent, there's a much higher possibility that the result of that debate will change. But incidentally, I think that, especially in KNC, what really shocked me was the appointment process of the CAP wasn't very formal to me. It didn't sound very efficient or reflective of the interests of the entirety of KIDA. It seemed like the CA just appoints it. It seems like one of a trophy, basically, of hosting KNC, which is necessary because a lot of institutions aren't willing to host KNC. But at the same time, if it's going to be a national tournament that is going to be very prestigious, and CAPs obviously have a huge influence over judge allocations, and CAP has a huge influence over what kind of topics will be set, I think it's important that that process reflects more feedback from KIDA. But getting back to tagging. So, tag system used in KNC was high-middle. So the top team goes against the middle team, next top team, second best team goes against the next team, and just goes down like that. The bright side of this, and it makes sense in probably the top bracket, because we want to make sure that the lowest seeded, so basically the lowest seeded team in the 3-1 bracket has a fair chance of, so this bracket says, so high middle, this is how normally tournaments I think are tabbed in Korea. Then probably the better way is, or not better way, but at least one other option that I think should be seriously considered is high-low. Because it is more meritocratic to have a high-low system. It might not be a very appealing idea to say that the strongest teams will get the weakest opponents. That might not seem very fair, especially in the top bracket. But generally, in all other brackets, it is more important to reward a 2-2 team that is doing well than a 2-2 team that is in the middle. So the idea of debate is that obviously if you do well, you get a prize, you win a debate. That's the whole idea behind debate. And not the whole idea, but to one important aspect of debate. And the tabbing should try to incorporate that philosophy. And in order to be meritocratic, I think that the strongest teams, the team that is doing best, maybe it might be a very rookie team that is doing incredibly well because they have earned really high speaker points in earlier rounds, should get a weaker opponent in order to advance to a break, have a higher possibility of advancing to a break round. And I think that should be the philosophy behind pulling up to pull-ups. So if there's an odd number of 2-2 teams, which team should be pulled up from the 1-3 bracket is probably, there's a case to be said that weakest 1-3 team should be pulled up for the strongest 2-2 team. Not necessarily because that's going to produce the best debate, but because that if you pull up the best performing 1-3 team in order to make a much more even matchup, then that really punishes the 1-3 team that is doing well just because it just doesn't seem fair. Rather, in order to ensure a fairness that you can't ensure, I think it's always going to be better to stick to a principle of meritocracy, and this allows more teams that are doing well in the 2-2 bracket to advance into the break rounds, and that might be a good thing to consider. But all in all, this is just a suggestion. This is just like an example of a suggestion. The real suggestion I want to make is probably you should have a closer examination of how the tax system in your tournament works, what's the system behind it, and how am I going to be matched up with other teams, because that will basically determine how you would do that debate. So, you should probably focus more on debate, which is meta debate. So, the majority of circuits, and this is something that Brett and I have been talking a lot about, especially after CES Open, but the majority of debate circuits that we've been to appreciates a style of debate that has broad areas of clash and consistency in team principle. That seems like a style in debate that a lot of Korean judges appreciate too. But to some extent, especially in BP debate, a lot of feedback from judges that I hear often is the idea of parallel debating. That parallel debating is bad, and it was a bit to some extent parallel debating. Therefore, you want to break the deadlock, and the team that broke the deadlock wins the debate. In a lot of instances, parallel debating is bad because it doesn't have engagement. But I think a lot of judges in Korea conflate the term of parallel debating to having broad clashes and basically having very different theories of how the world should look like. So, parallel debating isn't necessarily bad. The proposition and the opposition advance completely different theories of why the world works, and they don't agree upon which theory, they don't have a point of agreement in what's the best theory, then that is actually might be a very good form of debate, because there's much more clash, there's much more, there's a greater principle clash behind it about possibly how should humans organize, or what's the source of happiness for humans, and those generally larger questions should be appreciated. But oftentimes I see a lot of judges, because they just learned the language of being a good adjudicator, call debates saying that, I think it was parallel debating because there wasn't many points in that both teams agreed upon. Therefore, when the closing government came up and said, this is the important question that should be answered in this debate, they win the debate. But the problem with that is it doesn't award a form of debating that is genuinely good and that is genuinely interesting, which is having diverse clashes, which is having very, very broad principle clashes. So, for example, one example that I heard of during, I think it was KIDA Prime, or I'm not sure whether it was CUDS or KIDA Prime, was that one person was talking about in a corporate rights debate, in order increasing taxation for very rich people, both teams generally agree upon what having more taxation is better, and then the debate starts. But sometimes it might be a much more interesting debate for the opposition team to not agree with that and say, actually, taxation at that level is a property rights violation, and that is theft. And take a much more libertarian stance of saying how the most justified government is a small form of government. I think it's but the problem is when those things happen, it is deemed as kind of parallel debate because these two teams have basically no areas of agreement. They disagree on the most fundamental questions of debate of whether we should have higher taxation or not. It is an easier debate to adjudicate if both teams agree. So jury debates are easier debates to adjudicate because it's just about, here's a set goal that you guys both aim for, which side gets better. And that becomes a question of practical argumentation. And that's a debate that's very, very easy to judge. But the harder debate to judge, and probably the more interesting debate, is having completely different goals in the first place. And having a question of which goal is much more valuable and why. And I think that is conflated as this, whatever parallel debating is, I'm not actually really sure what that means now, but whatever parallel debating is considered and, to some extent penalized in, especially the Korean BP circuit. So that's something that we should think of much more.
What if your OON gets boxed out because of that? I think that's the primary
The
reason
O, why the
people-
O gets boxed out?
Yeah, for example, like if O took that stance, but CO decides to go with concedes and
Isn't that naiving?
So two things to talk about that. First is you can possibly reject the premise because in North American debate BP circuit there is no such thing as a CO knifing a OO. That's just considered to be impossible. Unless you, of course, unless you directly contradict them and say, you know what, let me rebut the OO's argument. But it says, so many judges, including Brett and including Steve Penner, if you know who he is, who's a very influential judge, believes that there is no such thing as knifing an opposition. So that might be one way to think about it. And that can be justified. There's no right answer about it, and there can be discussion about it, which is the whole point of having a discussion of meta debate. But the second thing to say there is there are very subtle ways, and like Australian teams are really good at this, and there are really subtle ways to tell why that's not a knife. And like you can have a different, basically a different goal on the closing opposition. It doesn't have to like you don't have to contradict them, or you can like try to talk about try to emphasize the rebuttal aspect of that and say opening opposition. I've talked about like this important goal. Whatever. On closing opposition, we're going to defeat opening government's best case scenario. So even if they're right, here's our case. Like whatever that is. Like so the burden that you take on might be a way to resolve that tension of knifing.
No, I mean in that case wouldn't OO get boxed out, and isn't that why a lot of people are reluctant to take a really hot stance?
Yes and no, because I think right now, if you do that form of debating right now in Korea, probably you will be boxed out. But it's a question of short term might be bad, but long term long term, that's a style of debate that is generally very well appreciated, and you should be doing that because those are probably more interesting. Other than trying to, I think a lot of times in the opening half in Korean, in the debates that I've been in Korea, is trying to approximate or trying to do what the closing might do. And trying to just take what the closing would do, or steal their material, or trying to make sure that closing doesn't have a lot of hurt. That shouldn't be, although that's an important, good strategy, I guess, to some extent, an effective strategy, that shouldn't be what you will, what BP is about. It should be more about trying to have 4 different perspectives and having a much more, rich debate. Whew. I can talk for a long time. Yeah, let's just go through it very quickly. So yeah, going to a lot of international tournaments, very good. You should all go to more international tournaments. And one thing is, when I don't distinctly remember when a person named Gemma Buckley decided to go to KIDA IV, there were some people I know had some complaints about it. I heard some people talking about why that shouldn't happen. Like she's second best speaker in the world. Why should she debate in this? Or when some very old, seasoned, good debaters participate in CUDS Open, some people were like, why are they doing this? It's now our era. Those things should be discouraged. I think you should probably welcome participation, and that's how actually you get very good practice in these regional tournaments and do better in a lot of different, more important tournaments like KNC, because those people can't come to KNC, or Worlds, because those people can't participate in Worlds. One thing I did before going to Worlds this year was going to 2 Australian tournaments, which was Sydney Mini and Melbourne Mini. And that is where I learned almost 70% of what I know about BP, because it was so much good training. I didn't break at both tournaments. I spent a lot of money to fly to Australia, and we had a great time, but I wasn't very successful in both tournaments. Yet I learned so much because in the Melbourne IV, round two I think, I was in a room with Paul Karp, who was a World's Grand Finalist the previous year, Sydney A, who won Worlds this year, and this other random Shanghai team. But that's a round that you probably can't get in any other debating practice. And that's something that you should try to embrace. Your debating career goal isn't to win CUDS Open, and it isn't to win KIDA IV. Rather, it's probably to do well in KNC, or try to be a better debater so that you can participate in international tournaments. Those things are actually, the larger goals are achieved better if you have stronger competition, and therefore you should try to encourage, a lot of good debaters. So if Talon and Abby says that they're going to quit debating, you should try to invite them back to come to tournaments so that they can kick a lot of people's asses. Yeah, I'm really tired now. You should have more tournaments is what I wanted to say here. There were much more things. But generally, tournaments don't necessarily have to have opening ceremonies. You don't even have to have sanjang. You don't even have to have like food all the time. All you have to do is need a room, and you need like a big enough room to gather how many participants you have. Some tournaments in America has 4 rooms. One BP tournament in America had 4 rooms. And it was still a very useful, like, you know, very good practice for the people who were there. So I think a lot of people seem to be like unwilling to host tournaments that only have very small participants, but that shouldn't be a thing. You should probably host more. You can try to have theme tournaments, like the HYDS can host a tournament, like
Harry Potter.
the Harry Potter ID.
A Song of Ice and Fire.
You know, what's another interesting?
Game of
What?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. There we go.
A Song of Ice and Fire. Gosh.
Oh, okay. You said that. I couldn't hear it because of your accent.
Oh.
Yeah. So, yeah. Whatever. That's what I prepared. I probably could talk about more, but whatever.
Thank you.
It is like very matter heavy and it's for nerds and it's very hard. It's for people with strong personality and it's very not approachable. I think there's many reasons for that. For example, the Korean education itself doesn't really comprehend the debating or like talking back or thinking critically in classrooms. Many reasons and many things that has to be done to overcome this. But the 2 questions that I have is first, I may have missed this because I came very late, but how do like the students in America view debate? What do they think of debate? What's debate to them? And my second question is, then I think until the education system changes or the generation changes, it's the burden of the seniors to take care of the further, so they would keep interest and they would stay until they figure out whether they actually like debate or what kind of style they have or what they are capable of. So how would you actually incentivize them until at least they figure out what debate is and whether they like it or not?
Okay, so to answer the first question of how debate is viewed in America, I genuinely am not going to provide a very good answer to it, but I can provide like some kind of proxy answers to it. So one thing that has a lot to do is just language, that it's, for Americans, it's just their mother tongue. So it's just, you know, like me complaining in Korean that there's too much homework. That's it's the same level of comfort to voice basically dissent. So there's a much lower barrier to debate because it's much more accessible than a Korean student to access English debate. To get to the point of, you know, just debate as a concept in general, there's some extent cultural reasons why it's easier to talk back and easier to be more active in America, because obviously it's a much more equal society, and like when you meet your friend's mom, they insist that you call them by their first name. It's all those things that make it much more accessible. But the viewpoint to debate, I think, is just basically expressing your thought. So it's never a way, it's probably more of a way of, I have this thought, I have this idea, I have this opinion, let me talk about that opinion. And it's not necessarily about, like, I'm going to persuade you, it's not necessarily about, I'm going to win this clash. It's more about just, I have this idea and I want to present it. And I think that's generally the vibe I get, but obviously that's not going to be a complete answer. I'm not even American, so. Yeah, well, the second thing was the role of Sundance, right? And if this is insufficient, you should like call me out and we can talk about this later. But the role of Sundance, I think, is to basically be a good judge. And like this was, I think Abby would know because this was a question in the Solbridge-Ostrow's adjudication test. And one of the questions was, what's a better argument, a principled argument or a practical argument? And the answer that the CAP let out was the idea that it doesn't really matter. It's about how well the argument is constructed. I think Sundance, because they are more experienced, should be more accepting to diverse styles that might be possible, and therefore try to look into not what kind of arguments they make, but how well the argument that they made is constructed, and how well, like whatever the conclusion is, even if the conclusion you think is stupid, how that process of reaching that conclusion was going to be good. And maybe, like, was there another question there? And like, was there a point I'm missing? Because I think there's a point I'm missing.
It's just like, how would you incentivize them?
How would you incentivize students to participate in debate? Well, again, I think that's the reason why I find that to be a very hard question is because it depends on who like the hubei is, right? Obviously. So if someone's really interested in going like very driven, going to other tournaments, that's you should incentivize that. If some people I think generally like want to hang out with a lot of people who just do debate. For those people, you can emphasize that you can make this community of friends that you can have a lot of fun with, you can drink with, you can share all these different ideas without being, deemed as a nerd. Yeah, but there are different aspects of debate, and there are different takeaways, there are different things that people take away from debate. And I think you should try to have a deeper conversation with them. It's so hackneyed, but have a deeper conversation and talk about what debate can offer to them and what kind of aspects are there.
What's the reason? Why did you start debating this stuff?
Why did I start debating? So for me, it was more about the performance. I watched a legal drama called Boston Legal, and there's this amazing show of rhetoric, and I just like that. And I get very nervous. So I'm a very shy person. I'm a very nervous person. I actually am. And I am. And like to that extent, I think debate kind of changed me. But the reason why I was so shy is I don't like showing people what I did or what I do unless I approve of it. So I don't want to have my numbers. I want to really prepare. One thing I really liked about debate is that I have a preparation time to really craft my thoughts and really make sure that this thing is acceptable to me and good for me, and then share it to other people. Then I am more confident in it because I spent some time on it, and it's more accepted. It's acceptable to me. Yeah. So it was generally about participation, doing performance and speaking out and stuff like that. And doing well, meeting a lot of good friends. I don't know. I'm gonna ask you later on why you started debating, but yeah.